Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on values in U.S. foreign policy. My name is Meredith Forsyth, and I'm a senior here in the School of Foreign Service, where I study international politics and African studies. I'm honored to be here today to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. For the past year, I've had the privilege to work at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, where I've learned how important values are to U.S. foreign policy, especially the way that women's meaningful inclusion, whether in the boardroom or the Situation Room, can transform our societies for the better. I believe that values can and should hold a critical place in our diplomacy and foreign policy. In a minute, you'll hear from 5 former State Department officials who have dedicated their lives to tackling these challenges. Their careers have spanned foreign service, diplomacy, advocacy, humanitarian work, and academia. First, we have Ambassador Roberta Jacobson. She served as the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico from 2016 until 2018, retiring from the State Department after more than 30 years. Before that, she served as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2012 to 2016. Next, there's Ambassador Victoria Nuland. A U.S. diplomat for 32 years, she holds the rank of Career Ambassador, and having serving as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs under President Obama and Secretary Kerry. She was State Department spokesperson during Secretary Hillary Clinton's tenure and U.S. Ambassador to NATO during George W. Bush's second term. Last month, she became CEO of the Center for New American Security. Next, we have Maria Otero, who was the first U.S. Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and served in that role from 2009 to 2013. Born in La Paz, Bolivia, she was the first Latina Undersecretary in State Department history. Prior to her service at the State Department, she spent 23 years working in microfinance and economic development. Next, we have Eric Schwartz, who has served as president of Refugees International since June 2017. He has had a 3-decade career focused on humanitarian and human rights issues, and most recently served as the U.S. Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. He was also the senior human rights and humanitarian official at the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. Finally, we welcome the moderator for today's panel, Ambassador Melanne Verveer. A Georgetown alumna, she is now the executive director for the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. She was the first U.S. ambassador at large for global women's issues from 2009 to 2013, and she currently also serves as the special representative for gender issues at the OSCE chairmanship. Ambassador Verveer co-founded and led Vital Voices Global Partnership for 8 years, and during the Clinton administration, she served as the assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Before I step off, I'd like to take a moment to thank our honored guest, Secretary Hillary Clinton, for being here, as her commitment to imbue our foreign policy with these values is unparalleled. Secretary Clinton, I never imagined that I would one day stand here and address you in this school that has taught me so much about values, representing an institute that you founded to put those values into practice, and with a conviction that I would dedicate my life to living them out, as you have done yours. You've inspired me and countless others. So as you're following along today, feel free to post about the event on social media using the hashtag #FutureOfDiplomacy. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy our panel today.
Each of you as well. I hope that our students can comprehend somehow the giant diplomats that are in this room. If you can find ways to tackle them, whisper to them, whatever you can do You will learn volumes from them. And for those of us who've worked together, it is quite overwhelming, which is why it was so difficult to get this panel started, because everybody is so excited to be together again. And we have another representative sampling of our diplomatic corps here on the stage. And I'm glad we at least have had one token male on all the panels so far. You know, it is no secret that we're discussing values in foreign policy. And as I look out at Secretary Clinton, who we welcome back, she has had so much to do with the establishment of our Institute on Women, Peace, and Security, which in many ways continues the work that she started at the State Department. But I've always associated values with you. And I was thinking, sitting here, of the days back when you weren't running the State Department. Many years earlier, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and you were going from country to country in the Baltic states and Eastern and Central Europe, trying to lift people up who didn't know what happened to them, how they were going to make a living, what this thing democracy meant. And that those American values you tried to get across and tell them it was not going to be easy, but what they whispered in their children's ears each night before they tucked them into bed were those habits of the heart that they needed to retain as they went through this transition. And I've always associated those moments with your deep commitment to these issues. And of course, in an unparalleled way, women's rights has been on top of the list. And I think no one would disagree that Hillary has been the primary exemplar for women's leadership around the world. And so we thank you for that, too. I want to put in a shameless plug, and that is that we've started a podcast at the Institute. And one of the featured voices is none other than our former Secretary of State. So when you're not stimulated at times or you're so angry at what's going on, when you need some inspiration, just go into iTunes and pull down Seeking Peace, and you can hear her. And now, to another fabulous group of people who have toiled over many years, committed to the values that we are going to discuss and why they are critically important. You may hear some of the themes from the previous panel. And as I think about it, that's no surprise, because those values deeply embed what the practitioners in this room have been associated with and practiced over a long period of time. So I want to start with an article that I read that many of you may have read by none other than Jake Sullivan, one of our former colleagues. It was in The Atlantic fairly recently, and the title of the article was, "Yes, America Still Can Lead." And in the context of this rather long article, he raises... I didn't really intend that. But he does raise issues, values. And he says that when you raise the importance of values, you're often greeted by rolling eyes. And there are two versions of these rolling eyes. One is the group that says, why should we be worried about values? Why should they be a priority? Why can't we just focus simply on securing our interests? The other set of rolling eyes has to do with those who feel that we've really not acted on our ideals much of the time. And so are we authentic when we raise a lot of these ideals and values in the course of our work? So I want to ask anybody who wants to respond to this, how do we deal with these rolling eye reactions? And why are values a strategic imperative? There's nobody shy on this panel.
No, go ahead. I'm going to go second.
You want to go second? All right, I'm not shy. First of all, what a fantastic afternoon this is. It gives me so much hope to see all these young people in the room who want to practice the craft of diplomacy going forward, want to wear America's t-shirt out there in the world, and congrats to Georgetown for the education that it provides. But also, this is a family reunion of so many people who worked so proudly and happily in the State Department under Secretary Clinton's tenure. And there was an energy there, and it was American diplomacy at its best, so thank you. Jumping into this question, why do we care about values? If you look at most of the points of conflict around the world, if you look at most of the places where danger comes to the United States, whether you're talking about the great power competitors, whether you're talking about the terrorists, whether you're talking about destabilization that is causing migration, et cetera, at the root of almost all of those places, people are not free. They are not choosing their government. They are not expressing themselves through free media. They don't have confidence in their justice system. And those people who are leading these movements or countries do so via various forms of repression. They are almost always not representing the vast majority of those that they govern. And they only govern because they repress, not because they empower. The net result of that is danger to the United States. It is danger to our allies and friends who want to live freely. And it is a constant cycle of people saying no to that system of life and wanting what they see in our countries. And when you look at the most successful partnerships that the United States has around the world, whether it's our European allies, our Asian allies, our Middle East partners, et cetera, our partnership with Israel, et cetera, our partnerships in Africa where we have strong democracies, it is because those governments are legitimate. It is because they can't be destabilized by these forces of repression coming up from underneath that we can count on them to work with us on security, on keeping trade open, on empowering citizens to live in peace and freedom, and therefore to support their governments. And it is for that reason that the United States has an interest in expanding the world of countries that live freely and expanding the number of citizens around this planet who respect and feel that they participate in the choices that their governments make. These repressive governments are simply an ongoing threat to us, and they make bad partners. And we do so much better in the world when we work with free people. And the beacon that we put forward of freedom and openness also stimulates people around the world to want to say no to governments that want to repress them. And if we don't partner with them, then we betray the very values that make us as strong as we are and that beacon.
So if I can, I think, first of all, I'd like to associate myself with most of what Toria said. I think she's absolutely right. Thank you, Milan. Thank you, Secretary Clinton, for this opportunity to be with the rest of the family today. Sometimes dysfunctional, but always loving, like all families. To me, to take that one step further in terms of why the notion of having a foreign policy based on values or a moral imperative versus strategic imperatives is a really interesting one practically as well. I think the reason it has to be both, and you have to have the moral imperative be part, or the values be part of that foreign policy, are as many practical reasons as there are ideological or philosophical. One, I think when the two things diverge, you find very quickly that you lack public support in the United States for that policy. And so therefore the policy is unsustainable both externally in the country you're trying to move forward on strategic imperatives without regard to the values, and certainly unsustainable in the United States over time, lessons learned in Vietnam or elsewhere. Because part of the reason they lose support is that they diverge from our values, that there's a cognitive dissonance there. Second, I think there's always been a case to be made that when we follow the strategic imperatives and discard or temporarily put on hold the values part of it, those policies are much more likely to have to be carried out in secret. Partly for the first reason, partly for other reasons. Also, something that becomes increasingly unsustainable. Sunlight as a disinfectant, as a sort of stimulant for public debate, and debate internationally with allies and others, is often the best way to craft better policy, and almost inevitably then joins those two things again, the strategic importance and the values. And when that cost-benefit analysis, if you will, being very sort of clear-eyed about this, gets very out of whack, you find that eventually you end up with Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi killing, or a situation in which we've subordinated one to the other, maybe logically for years, maybe not, whether it's nuclear states or petro-states, and ultimately we betray ourselves and we lose the ability to work with that country as an ally.
But that said, and the students have often raised this with me, how do you reconcile, particularly in terms of our relationship that you raised with Saudi Arabia, strategic interests, but also our values often clash with, and present realities are one of those examples. How do we do both? How do diplomats navigate in this complicated situation?
I'll give you a short answer to that question, and then I'll talk about what I'm thinking about. The answer is they do. I mean, the answer is they do. The notion that, in a complex world, you can't deal with competing imperatives and figure out ways to manage both, I think is just wrong. And we can talk about the Khashoggi case, but I want to make another point because I want to sort of challenge an assumption that gave rise to your comment, your initial comments, Milan, which is that, the notion that values should not inform foreign policy making has not reflected, the broad understanding of American, foreign policy, for decades. If you think about the Democratic Party, the human rights approach of Jimmy Carter, the more vigorous approach of folks in the Democratic Party like Richard Holbrooke, but both kind of sides of the Democratic Party on foreign policy, different views about America's capacity to make change in the world, but no disagreement on the importance of values in the execution of foreign policy. And if you look at the Republican Party, I mean, the principal sort of intellectual forces within the party over the past couple of decades, the neoconservatives of our friend Elliot Abrams, Paul Wolfowitz. For those guys, values were critically important in the execution of foreign policy. Paul Wolfowitz was one of the greatest, strongest advocates for U.S. engagement in Bosnia. Even the traditional foreign policy realists, the George H.W. Bush, who talked about a new world order after Iraq. And I would even say the Republican isolationists have a values-based approach, which is, we ought to let other countries decide what they want to decide. Now, don't get me wrong. I realize, that the present, occupant of the Oval Office has a different perspective on a lot of these issues. And I also realize that there are, some foreign policy thinkers, I would call them the uber Hobbesians in the Republican Party. And I don't mean to make this partisan because I've just talked about Republican commitment to values in foreign policy, but there are those who believe that the only objective for our foreign policy has got to be that the United States, the world is a nasty place, and the United States has got to be the big dog, and that's about as far as it goes. But that sentiment, traditionally in our body politic, has not reflected the consensus. So I think that the notion that somehow we have to defend the idea that values should play a role in policymaking, I think is wrong.
Go ahead.
I mean, I agree with that. I think a value-driven foreign policy is at the core of what we should do. And let me just, before I make a couple of points on that, just say how incredibly happy and honored I feel just sitting up here and looking out on this wonderful stage and looking again at Secretary Clinton, who we worked with and for so many years. So it's just a really wonderful opportunity for us to, I want to say, recall the good times. But, you know, when we talk about a value-driven foreign policy, Eric is right. Those issues have been before us, but what level of importance do we give them as we carry out our diplomacy, our foreign policy, and how do we connect them to foreign policy? And, you know, when you think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights it was really the most important document to come out from after a war that almost tore this planet apart. Those are really a statement of the rights that individuals have, and our own policy needs to be able to have that be really what breathes into our foreign policy. For me, there's one other piece in a values-driven policy is that if you really take it seriously, then you understand that the well-being of people around the world is probably one of the most important ways to safeguard our own national security. And that as part of our policy, we should find a way to be able to reach those that are most vulnerable, most isolated, most threatened in the societies of the countries that we interact with. And that we should help countries provide security for them, protect them, engage in a way to expand the speaking area or the functioning area that they have in their own countries. You know, I can think of a list of different areas in this, starting with women and engaging women in everything that we do. We know that that's critical. It absolutely helps. But we also look at other groups, whether it's LGBTQ groups, whether it's religious freedom minorities, people that are being trafficked, human rights defenders. I mean, we can go through a whole list of those populations that are really live very insecurely. And let me make a distinction here, because if we're working in countries where there are elected governments, your ability to work on these issues is, of course, different than if you're working in authoritarian regimes that constrict the space and, in fact, imprison people and don't allow them to operate and in some cases cause enormous damage and torture. And so there's different ways in which we can do that. But the notion that Secretary Clinton created an undersecretary to address civilian security, democracy, and human rights as a way to improve our own capacity to incorporate values into the work that we do is a way in which the Department of State was really speaking to the rest of the world and saying, you know, these are the issues that we really should be addressing.
I don't think it's so much the question of, is there a role for values? And Eric, you posited that very well. But it's what you said, what significance do we give them when you're in a situation where you're weighing an awful lot of options. Do we really condemn human rights violations at a time when there's another critical negotiation going on with the country that is not particularly doing the right thing on human rights? So there are these clashes, not that we don't find values as a critical element, a seminal, important, foundational element of our foreign policy. So I think that's something, and I would imagine that some of the students will raise this, because it's a struggle. How do you make these decisions?
But America at its best always ought to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right?
And America at its best.
Right, America at its best. But also, sitting with Secretary Clinton when she was working with Libyans or the Chinese or anybody else, yes, you're trying to find common interest, you're trying to find common security, but you're also saying to those leaders, you will be stronger if you treat your own people better. They don't always listen. But these things are not mutually exclusive. And that's how you balance, including with the Saudis. This kind of behavior undercuts your legitimacy as a global actor, undercuts your legitimacy with your own people, and puts you at risk. That's the argument that you can make in the context of whatever other project you might be working on. And I was proud to watch the Secretary do that with elegance.
It's a very challenging question, and I think the issue that you've just addressed really has to do with tactics,
Yeah.
right? Which is, okay, we have values, and we try to execute them and implement them in different ways in different circumstances. And I think that's absolutely true, and very important. But I do think sometimes we face these dilemmas, which is, how do we respond publicly to something that is so shameful in circumstances where, we have some view that responding privately might have a greater impact or might do less damage to a bilateral relationship. And there's no getting around the fact that that's a hard question. And I think for those of us who believe in the importance of values in foreign policy, I also think if you believe in that, then you also believe that the policy has to have integrity. It has to have consistency of character. And that means in certain instances, you're going to have to make a decision to say something publicly or be tougher or sacrifice the relationship in order to preserve the credibility of your overall articulated policy that values are important. And you make those choices a case at a time. I think the Khashoggi case is a great example, because there, some of us feel that the right action would be to take much stronger and sterner public measures with an understanding that will result in some sacrifices in a bilateral relationship, dare I say an important bilateral relationship. But it's based on the conviction that the overall credibility of a values-informed foreign policy is more important than what you sacrifice in that particular case. But those are hard decisions to make.
And just 2 points I would make as well. First, having been the ambassador in Mexico until last May, you can imagine that this debate, internal, came up a lot.
You think?
They pay for the wall.
Yeah, I was pretty sure of that early on. But the fact is, we need the Mexican government for all kinds of things that are critically important to us, right? Whether it's the fact that fentanyl is killing people at 72,000 overdose deaths in 2018, of which the majority were fentanyl, and the fact that if we're going to keep the country safe from fentanyl, from meth in particular, heroin, we're going to have to do it with the help and support of the Mexican government. And ensure that nothing else comes through those routes as well, which it never has, in fact, other than drugs and people. But it didn't keep us from being extremely critical that nothing was being done to stop the murders of journalists. Not necessarily by government actors, but in some cases by government actors, in some cases by cartels. And it irritated the government enormously when I did that. It irritated the government enormously that I was the first ambassador to give a speech on corruption and anti-corruption efforts and falling short. Those kinds of things have to be weighed and balanced, but in the end, they were done in a way. I was proud of the group of people in Mexico that did not actually interrupt the lifeline, the critical engagement with Mexican anti-narcotics forces that we so deeply needed. And the last thing I would say is some of the problem is a relatively unimaginative foreign policy that I think unfortunately has become the norm, which is punishment, right? Your reaction to everything is sanctions. I don't know how many people OFAC has now, but they obviously need millions to implement the number of sanctions because we just, there's the sanction of the week club. That can't be your only policy. If all you're thinking about is what should we cut off, what should we not do, how should we punish them, then you're going to miss opportunities and you're going to look only, obviously, at a negative foreign policy instead of what are we doing to encourage, to reward, and to promote.
Carrots, good point. I want to turn to another value, and Maria, I'm going to turn to you anyway, so whatever you were going to say, you can add to it. And that is, we've got the experience. Most of us have seen this now. We're in UNESCO, we're out of UNESCO. We're in, we're out. Human Rights Council, out, in, out again. The climate change agreement. Why does it matter in terms of our own interests, our own value systems, to be a credible player in the multilateral world? And what price do we pay for these kinds of actions?
Well, it's, and it will weave into what I was going to say earlier. Of course, I have to weave it. But part of what it raises, is the fact that we have a series of multilateral agencies, many of them associated with the UN, some partly associated, like the World Trade Organization, and some that are more focused on economic growth, World Bank and so on. But when you look at the structure that we've created and that we have depended on to address just a myriad of different issues, this is the architecture that we have, even if it has some problems or not. For us not to be able to play a role in them eliminates our own ability also to lead and to, through those organizations, work regionally in a significant way, and also work with players who may have not worked together in the past and that we can bring together. The Human Rights Council was a perfect example of that, the UN Human Rights Council. When we rejoined that, and there were initiatives in place, we could play a very active role in engaging all the Latin Americans to address a given issue, or bringing Egypt and another country that that had never worked together to be able to work together. And that, for us, was also a way to provide leadership and to align also the value part of what we're doing. And I think that piece is a very important one for us to address, because we're becoming more and more and more isolated. And if we are not at the table helping set the agenda and helping fashion it on the very issues that you've addressed, and on many, many that exist, then we can't be leaders either.
So if you have a grievance, you don't walk out the door. You you work inside the system.
Yeah, because that's really the system that we have. And I just wanted to make one additional point, which was that in this, and it was touched by especially Arsha before, but as we talk about these multilateral organizations and the way in which we interact, there is no question that issues that have to do with working through civil society become absolutely key. And an ambassador today doesn't just interact with government activities. I mean, we look at the fabric of organizations that allow citizens to participate, to engage, and to also complain to their governments and to try to make things change. And so I think that piece is just very important for us to both understand. Secretary Clinton always addressed this issue, and she may have not, if you just allow me, I'll just tell one quick story. Maybe she wouldn't have gone this far, but I remember when we were in Cartagena in Colombia with one of the summit events, the Latin American summit event. You know, I'm from Bolivia. If you're in Cartagena, Colombia, you dance. I mean, you don't just go there and do diplomacy, you dance. And so Jake Sullivan was there, Roberta was there, but I thought, well, why don't we bring Secretary Clinton to carry out some cultural diplomacy and go to one of the local get-togethers, which was actually called Havana, and dance and be able to be really engaged. And so Secretary Clinton and several of us carried that out. And that was, you know, the part of the reason I'm telling this story is because the next day, the newspapers in Colombia, you have no idea the way in which they expressed and the way in which they said, you know, this is exactly the kind of interaction that we want to have. So I think the point also is we just got to kick our legs up.
It turned out to be the biggest news that came out of the summit.
Nobody remembers what the
That's right, nobody with business, but in any case.
You are dealing with one of the great crises in our world today, refugees. It's a space in which you've been operating. We are at unprecedented levels, a humanitarian crisis, a populist backlash fanned by politicians who want to create more havoc with this problem, and great difficulty, not just how it's being used here, but in Europe. What is failing? What is not operating well? What do we learn from this? Because this is a problem we're going to continue to see. God knows what climate change is going to bring to more and more people having to leave where they live because of what that crisis is going to create. So what do we learn from this?
We can talk in great detail.
We don't have time for great detail.
Okay. No, that's why I said. That's why I said we can. But I won't. But I'm going to use your question to make a point which I think is very fundamental, and we haven't really talked about it. To me, it reflects the critical importance of American leadership. The United States right now is providing anywhere between a quarter and a third. I used to say a quarter. Pat Kennedy used to say, yeah, that's in the budget, but how much we actually spending? And the spending was a third of world humanitarian assistance. So by definition, we're leaders, but we're not leading. And so why is that important? Why is that important? So I want to take your question and talk a little bit briefly about why that's important. Because by the conventional, what's this? This conversation is about foreign policy, and foreign policy is about the effectuation of American interests, however we define them. You know, not to put too fine a point on it. You know, achieving our objectives in the world, and right now by the conventional measurements of power, power is rapidly fleeing from the West and going to the East. Within 2 decades, three of the 4 largest economies will be Asian, including the world's largest economy, which will be China. 48% of venture capital for artificial intelligence last year went to China. So in terms of the conventional measurements of power, technological advancement, military capacity, economic power, power is shifting from west to east. And our relative power, measured in that conventional way, is diminishing. That's a fact. So the question is, in that context, is transactional diplomacy our best tool to sustain, the power that we have to increasingly be careful about marshaling? Do we achieve our power through more of a values-based approach, which looks at issues like smart power, engagement in multilateral institutions, where the United States has the capacity to exercise leadership based on a perception that we are not being transactional, that we care about other issues, and that helps to helps us to safeguard our power in the world. But if you look at the institutions of smart power, of multilateralism, where we have been so successful in gaining and actually increasing our influence, who's working those institutions right now? It ain't us. It's the governments of the world who have a much more traditional realist approach to foreign policy. In the Human Rights Council, it's the government of China. In overseas aid efforts in places like Africa, it's the government of China. And at a time in which our capacity to hold on to the traditional measurements of power is inevitably going to be limited. This is actually in world history the worst, in the history of the past several decades, the very worst time for us to be thinking about diplomacy in transactional terms, because it's the time in which we need to be marshaling our authority. So my answer to your question on the humanitarian side is, American leadership is critically important, but unfortunately we're not there on issues like, how to deal with the Rohingya challenge, how to deal with challenges in South Sudan. And when we are there, I don't think the world is completely convinced that we are operating for in a multilateral context to affect the greatest good for all. And sort of talking about armed intervention in Venezuela is probably not the best way to communicate that. And so I think that really, for me, when I think about the subject of this panel, I think about the world and what we are. Some things we have to give up. Some things we are gratuitously giving up. And I think that's a real concern.
So let's move from that comment, particularly in Venezuela, to you, Roberta. You had mentioned earlier that our answer to everything seems to be sanctions. Very hard power answer, not using other levers, not using other carrots. What else could we be doing in situations like this?
Well, I mean, on Venezuela, I think obviously certain sanctions, to be honest, I think are entirely valid. In particular, I think the blocking of assets and the hopefully more effective imposition so that Maduro can't get at his assets overseas. But I will say that, a number of years ago, we all in this group here, and at least 1 or 2 people here actually had this conversation, talked about the way the Venezuelans exercised projection of their own power in the hemisphere, in particular through Petrocaribe and the use of oil with countries that had very bad energy situations, and how relatively cheap it would have been for the United States to put forward a program of energy efforts with the Caribbean, that the reason that would matter is not numbers of population, but right now when we look at the OAS or even other institutions, you've got 14 Caribbean votes quite a few of which are sort of still locked up in an old Petrocaribe system, which they should no longer be loyal to, obviously, but it's to play a better role in our multilateral efforts. Those 14 Caribbean votes, we seek them for everything, right? Is it Syria? Is it the Middle East? Is it other things? And we don't get them routinely. And part of that is their alliance to countries that have, frankly, invested more over the time, with us taking them for granted or ignoring them altogether. And so this international system, which you can say is what we have, but it's what we designed.
Yeah.
It's what we designed because it was and is beneficial to us. Now, clearly others have kind of figured that out and engaged in the system differently, but our backing out of it is a bad thing for our own national interests. And that's a perfect example of where a relatively limited investment, and I've always said this about the Western Hemisphere in general, a relatively limited investment will pay enormous dividends in terms of support for the United States, not just in things like Venezuela, but in other areas that are important to us globally. And we've really failed to engage on our own values with countries that are sort of instinctively aligned with us, but have not been offered any encouragement, incentives, rewards, whatever you want to call it, to be by our side.
And I remember how much, Secretary Clinton, you stressed those Asia-Pacific islands and the work that was done collaborating with New Zealand and Australia and others, because they have votes. They were important in and of themselves, but they also were critical players, as you just pointed out, in another part of the world. And anybody who's been to China, as many of us have been and gone to conferences that China convenes, those islands are all represented there in very significant ways. So I think there are points here that the students especially can be picking up that will serve you in good stead no matter what you go on to do. Let me just move, because we have to go to questions, to Toria. We've got a very turbocharged Russia today, operating hybrid wars, disruption with huge consequences on so many different levels. You dealt with it when you were still at state with respect to Ukraine. That goes on. How does this conversation on values fit into a situation like that?
So as I said at the beginning, it is the autocrats and anti-democrats of the world who pose the greatest threat to us, whether they are states or whether they are terrorists. Russia is a country where for the past 20 years they haven't invested much in their own people. When you take a poll of average Russians as to what they care most about, it is not holding Ukraine or dominating the Middle East. It's, why does my hospital not work? Why do I have to pay a bribe to get into university? So, but this is a tactic of statecraft, of leaders who are not succeeding at home, that they create a false sense of glory by expanding externally and by dominating others. It's an expensive strategy, it's a risky strategy, and eventually your population turns around and says, yeah, but did my life get better over the last 10 years? But that can take a long time to play out. But in the meantime, you have a Russia that has broken the post-Cold War compact in terms of invading neighbor space, in terms of using economic and other forms of political coercion to dominate neighbors, and using corruption as an export of state policy to undercut democracy and undercut citizens' rights in all kinds of countries throughout their neighborhood. And in the case of Syria, to make that country safe for the autocrat Assad. So, the question you have to ask is, how much is it worth to us to stand up to that and to say, you're not going to get any benefits of global leadership. You're not going to have the kind of top table conversation and seat that you want unless and until you come back into the general consensus, the state sovereign consensus. This is not about multilat versus state sovereigns, that we all live and let live rather than expanding. So, sanctions was a very useful tool. I think it was useful in stopping the Russians from getting all the way to Kyiv in 2015. But if it is not also tied to how you undo sanctions when the relationship improves or behavior improves or you focus on other things, it loses its efficacy. But it also needs to be tied to other things. So in the case of Russia, where I am now is we should be thinking in terms of both a bigger carrot and a bigger stick. A bigger carrot in the sense that we need to speak over the heads of leaders who are failing their own citizens to talk to Russian citizens about the benefits of having a freer, open, more European trading system, travel, all that kind of stuff with us, and the risks of increased cost, and the costs do need to increase if the behavior doesn't change, of continuing to violate the system.
It seems to me, and I'm no authority obviously, but that during the Cold War we were able to calibrate public diplomacy, the soft power, if you will, and the hard power, because we engaged in a whole lot of these kinds of things.
And we always spoke about standing with, in that case, the Soviet people, in this case, the Russian people, and their aspirations to live better. And, I remember my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1980, and we had this very sort of, would sound crude and cute today, this glossy magazine called America. It was like Life magazine, and you would go into small towns in Russia, and people that you didn't know would say, Amerikanka, and wave their couple copies because it had been so interesting to them and a window on what we could be if we worked together. So.
Well, there's an awful lot to unpack here. So students, take to the microphones, and we'll see what you have to say about this or ask about this. Go ahead, start.
Hi, my name is Becky Twelfhoven. I'm actually an undergraduate in the SFS. Thank you all so much for being here. My question is about universalism in promoting values. The case of Myanmar comes to mind, but other cases obviously around the world. How do you balance recognition and respect for the uniqueness of other cultures and other peoples around the world with the promotion of values and rights that we take as universal, like gender equality, like religious freedom?
It's you, girl. Well, let me just, I think that there are some values. I mean, there's no question that there are differences traditionally, and that if you are to look at the way in which culture plays itself out, you might find some differences. But there is just no question that some of the values which we would hold tight, which is basically promoting democracy, promoting human rights, are, at the core of everything that we would be able to do in any country. When you look at the status of women, for example, in different cultures and in different countries, it just varies dramatically. And Milan is really the person that has dedicated her life to working on these issues. And you have to address them differently depending on what part of the world you're in. But ultimately, the belief in equity and the belief that women should have the opportunity to be able to really play out all their possible opportunities and growth remains a value that it doesn't matter if you're in Myanmar or in Cameroon or in Guatemala, you hold up. And and this is why it becomes so important to work with civil society organizations, because they show you the way as well. They are advocating, they're promoting, they're protecting, and they are the ones that can also, in working directly with them, you're not there dictating. You're not there standing, aside and saying this is the way that you should do things. You are working directly with them, and you're strengthening their own capacity to empower their own people. And so I think this is one of the pieces that is really important to remember as we're doing the work. The emphasis on, and Secretary Clinton did this every time. Every trip she took, she would meet with NGOs, she would meet with members that represented different civil society organizations who could really expand our own understanding of how to address some of these issues. And that, I think, is just one of the essential tools that we have that we need to, that we really need to make use of. And it supports the point that Eric was making about, this is what you have to marshal together and work through.
But I think one of the suspicions always on the part of some is that these are values foisted by the West, and they are not values that are permeating the societies where certain people would prefer this not to be happening. They're people to be free or women to have certain rights. When working with civil society, it's not, this is what you should do from us. It's they're saying to us, this is what we want to have happen. And as you asked the question, I was thinking yesterday the Taliban put out a statement at the Moscow conference on how committed they are to women's rights. And then that statement proceeded to go through all of the ways that needed to be constrained because of the values in their society. So,
can I say one thing about this? I think it's also important not to overstate this dilemma. You mentioned the Rohingya issue. And, first of all the governments of the world, by acceding to the UN Charter, have explicitly articulated a commitment to the promotion of internationally recognized human rights. And I guess in theory there are close cases, but in the case of like the Rohingya example which you gave, what are we talking about? We're talking about rape, forced killings, forced expulsion, torture, and no government in the world would say, we do that and we think we should do it. What they say is they lie. They say we don't do it when they do. So I think there may be some issues where there are close calls, but I think you got to be careful about overstating this problem.
this side.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Goodman. I'm a conflict resolution student. My question was actually in the context of negotiations with the Taliban. How is it possible to protect American values when negotiating with very hardline groups like the Taliban that historically have not been willing to make any compromises, aside from the values themselves, the lack of compromise?
So a key sine qua non in this negotiation that we're having now is that the Taliban needs to accept the tenets of the Afghan constitution, an Afghan constitution that we worked with them on so that it would conform with UN principles. Now, the rubber hits the road not in what they say, but in how things are implemented. So what you don't want at the end of the day is a Taliban return to dominance. At best, what you want is the Taliban integrated into the political system and winning some seats in parliament or some ministries, but understanding that they share power within the overall umbrella of these rights. But one can get cheated on this. The Afghan people can get cheated, and then the question becomes, what does the United States do to reinforce the spirit and the letter of the deal that we helped to broker?
You want to end the hostilities, and everybody wants to see them end, you don't withdraw precipitously and give up that lever that you can still use to effectuate some of this.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Hernandez. I'm a graduate student in the Applied Intelligence program. This is a question open to all, but Mr. Schwartz, you mentioned transactional diplomacy. I'm aspiring to work in a place where, you can't really surge trust. I think we can all agree on that. How do we balance our individual interactions abroad with the not so defined, I'm not sure if it'll ever be defined, bold diplomacy that we are moving into or currently in?
I'm not. How do we balance our individual interactions with, you said, the bold diplomacy? Tell me a little bit more what you mean by that. Are you talking about the diplomacy of this administration or what we've been talking about here?
Yes. Yesterday evening, President Trump mentioned his new brand of bold diplomacy, especially with regards, this was during the State of the Union, with regards to his discussions with Chairman Kim Jong-un.
Oh, I see. Okay. I don't know. I don't know really where to begin because.
You don't have to make it short this time.
I will make it short. I think that, look, there are things that politicians say, and then there are things that politicians do, and I think when you're assessing, the actions of any administration, take into account what they say, but also look carefully at what they do. And diplomacy, bold diplomacy, to my mind, involves a strategy. It involves evidence-based actions. It involves perseverance, and it involves engagement with the whole of government in a manner that gives you confidence that the direction in which you're going is a direction that is going to be sustainable. And I, without making any comments about where the president stands on all this, or where I would assess that statement with respect to those criteria I just identified. And I think this presidential administration, I know we're not supposed to talk too much about it, but I'm just going to try to be analytical and not normative, has been characterized by very much transactional diplomacy without the kinds of elements I've just described. And notwithstanding the president's speech last night, I think the proof has got to be in the pudding.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hello, I'm a JD student at Georgetown University Law Center, and I'm actually a person that you mentioned, that generation in the late 80s and early 90s that was part of the transition of democracy in Russia and Eastern Europe, and there was a lot of hope, and I grew up with a lot of hope. I was raised with that, as you said, every night, about those sort of those hopeful stories about how it's going to change. And I think one of the problems and tragedies that have especially sharpened since 2014 have been just the realization that it's never going to change, that Ukraine, Moldova, all of these Eastern European countries are going to continue that struggle. And I find that the biggest problem is, as I see it, is there's no belief in institutions in Ukraine, especially in Russia. There's just this vicious cycle of the disbelief and the totalitarianism. And the less people believe in, there's no independent judiciary in these countries. So the less people believe, the less. So my question is, through diplomacy, what are some ways that this lack of belief can be alleviated?
Well, first, congrats on the trajectory of your life. I hope you continue to work on these issues as a lawyer. We're finding, particularly on the rule of law questions, that's where you can give people hope that their system can change when they can petition a court when they've been aggrieved, whether it's by their government or by their neighbors. So good on you for all of those things. Look, I think we, throughout the transition period in Central Europe and then moving further and further east, tried to tie American support to reform of the system, and reform of the system had to include strengthening of institutions. So whether it was alternation of power, creation of political parties, real elections that were transparent and met OSCE and UN standards, or whether it was free media, beginning to work hard on judiciaries and judiciary reform, something that, as you know, takes 10, 15, 20 years to solidify and can easily be derailed. In the Ukraine context, in the early years and still today, we tied IMF economic support, World Bank economic support to the government taking on corruption, to it establishing a anti-corruption court, to it having transparency in ownership of assets by elected politicians, et cetera. So we have lots of tools that we can use to serve as carrots for better governance. We also have lots of tools to use to expose. Roberta and I are the same generation of diplomats, and we always say, you know, to spread sunshine is the greatest disinfectant on dirty stuff going on. But at the end of the day, the country itself and the people of the country have to fight for those changes. And the other thing that, you know, if my life has taught me anything through this whole period of, you'll know this word, you know, great hope and then razочарование, you know, the disappointments, often these things are not linear. You know, often there are hills and troughs, and sometimes it takes very courageous individuals and very courageous leaders, and they are often, you know, they come by magic. So we have to be consistent and persistent, and we also have to remember that when we work with allies, these tools are even stronger because we force multiply the open arms that we have for change and the cost for not changing.
Can I just mention really quickly that it is not a problem only in Ukraine or Russia or Eastern Europe. It is the fundamental problem I see in the Americas. You see it in a crusading extraordinary judge, Sergio Moro, in Brazil during the Lava Jato anti-corruption work. But you also see a very, very dangerous situation of weak institutions that are not being strengthened even by elected presidents. And one of the things that worries me most is our losing the ability to talk about these things as a government, right? About strengthening institutions, about anti-corruption, because of weaknesses we're seeing here in our own system.
And I think investments in civil society, what Toria said, in Ukraine you see this dramatically where there's such a demand after the Revolution of Dignity by young people, well-educated people, and so many others really pushing the government along with whatever carrots and sticks we use to try to hasten those reforms.
Hi, my name's Adam. I'm a freshman in the SFS. I'm an undergraduate student. My question is on the question of values, something that you guys have talked about all this past hour. You've talked about equality, commitment to multilateral institutions, women's rights. But at the end of the day, these values have all been changing for the past 20th century. For the past hundreds of years, our values as Americans have always shifted, and our approach to foreign policy has always changed on the basis of this shift in those values. So in a time and age when our values are constantly changing and there seems to be a consensus at the moment of what those values are, how do we build that consensus, A, and B, what does it mean to have American values? What are those things? And how do you promote them on the world stage?
Go ahead.
You know, I don't think they've been changing. You know, I think the values, certainly a value-driven foreign policy for me means what I said earlier, which is really to promote democracy and promote human rights. We as a society are understanding more and more what it means to be able to have every citizen and human being be able to exercise their own God-given rights. From that perspective, we are if we look, for example, at some of the laws that have come, if you are gay, you can now marry. This is completely new, but it is for us a recognition that our understanding of the values that LGBTQ had were and continue to be limited within our society. And so we are opening ourselves more and more in order to be able to expand an open space for those that have been either oppressed or repressed or ignored. And we can look at so many examples of that in our own society, where we continue to face incredible shortcomings. I mean, if you listened yesterday to the voter suppression issues that have taken place just in the last elections of last November, and people from other countries coming up to me when I travel and they say, exactly how do you all go about voting? I thought everybody could vote and you didn't, suppress anybody's vote. You see that we still have enormous problems in the way in which we're addressing some of these values. And from our perspective, and that's why I said it's different when you work with some elected governments, for example, you can help them also see the kind of vulnerable populations, for example, people with disabilities or women overall, just in how they work, what they get paid, the way in which they have to do a double day. I mean, these are all areas in which we are evolving in our understanding and in the way in which we make societies more inclusive of everyone. So that I think is an ongoing process.
Milan, can I just say one thing? I noticed behind us we have the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I spotted a couple of public policy deans in the audience, and I think in terms of training young people in public policy and public affairs, we've been very successful in developing this commitment to evidence-based policymaking, which is critical to any discussion. What we haven't been as successful at is figuring out ways to translate these insights to the broader population at large. And that sounds very patronizing, but the fact is we haven't figured out, or communicators haven't figured out how to engage populations broadly who don't spend years studying public policy, and somehow that seems to me to be a critical nut to crack in terms of building a greater consensus on public affairs issues, because the start has got to be evidence. I mean, and values inform that, but that's a real challenge. I certainly don't have an answer for it.
The last question.
Hi, my name is Avram Reisman. I'm a second-year master's student in the Democracy and Governance program. My question concerns U.S. grand strategy. The critics of the U.S. grand strategy, known as liberal hegemony, have grown, if not in number, then in volume during the Trump administration and maybe a little bit prior. My question is, does the Trump administration have a new grand strategy? And if not, is there a need for a reevaluation of U.S. grand strategy for the 21st century? And finally, how should values continue to play a role in that?
You're asking us if the Trump administration has a grand strategy.
I think if you read their national security strategy, they emphasize great power competition as the greatest threat to the United States and organize their military, economic, and diplomatic approach around that. But at the same time, they see it as an American alone or American mostly challenge. So I think the question becomes, how do you take the very real challenge that they identified, and I think it is a challenge for the United States, of a of autocrats petitioning to change the rules of the road and doing it coercively and trying to undercut not only our alliances and our allies, but democracy within our own system. How do you combine that with the great strengths that America brings to the table, our friends and allies, and our values? And if I had one message back to the folks on the other end of town, it would be to say, our European and Asian partners are dying to work with us on the challenges of China, the challenges of Russia, the challenges of high technology, the challenges of immigration. Let's say yes, please.
Well, that does it for this panel.
Oh, everyone.
I have to say, Eric, my dear friend Eric, that the Humphrey School really turned you into a professor. And I want to thank his eminent colleagues here, but it's wonderful to have you all participate in this way. And now we're going to the main event.